Okay, share my screen again. So first I will go through and introduce each of our panelists, and they'll give you a quick overview of who they are. My name is Lauren Napier, and I am the program director for the Center for Spacefaring Civilization. Then I will hand it off to Dr. Thomas Cheney, who is the executive director of Spacefaring Civilization.
Hi, yep, so I'm Dr. Thomas Cheney, Executive Director of the Center for Spacefaring Civilization and a lecturer in space governance at the Open University. I co-founded the center with Lauren, I think 3 years ago now, which is kind of a scary anniversary. But this is our first webinar, and we hope that you enjoy it. We've had a lot of fun putting it together.
Okay, next I will go with Dr. Tanya Harrison.
I'm Dr. Tanya Harrison, and I'm a planetary scientist. I've spent the last 12 or so years of my career working in science and mission operations for various NASA Mars missions, including Opportunity, Curiosity, Perseverance, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Currently, I'm the manager of science programs at Planet Labs, based out of the federal office in Washington, D.C.
Thanks. Next, we have Annie Hanmar.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the University of Sydney in the School of History and Philosophy of Science, and I study essentially how we relate to space technologies and how scientists work together in Antarctica and elsewhere in the world to do with space. I'm also a member of the Australian and New Zealand Space Law Interest Group, the Australian Youth Aerospace Association, the Space Generation Advisory Council, and I'm on the Ethics and Human Rights Project Group. And I'm on the Advisory Council for the Space Industry Association of Australia. And I also am the host and creator of the Space Junk podcast.
Thanks. Okay, and we now have Nadia Khan.
Hi there, I'm Nadia. I'm a part-time space risk and disaster reduction student at UCL. As part of my course, I cover issues to do with space weather and extreme events on Earth. I'm also currently on the Interactive Space Studies program at the International Space University, and I'm part of the projects coordinator team at the Space Generation Advisory Council and a visiting researcher at the Center for a Spacefaring Civilization.
All right, now I'll pass it over to William, our communication coordinator, and he's also going to go through a couple of things for today.
Hi, yes, my name is William, and I'm the communications coordinator, as Lauren mentioned. It's a new role for me, just started last month. So yeah, I have a strong interest in space, but my main professional background is in writing and journalism. But yeah, I have a strong interest in communications in space. So this is very exciting, and yeah, looking forward to the event. Yeah, so just a few really quick notes from me before we jump straight in. As Lauren mentioned, the session will be recorded and it will be available to view afterwards on our website and YouTube channel. So if you know of anyone who was interested in today's event but was unable to join, you could send them that way and they can check it out afterwards. I hope you'll find it entertaining and informative. And just a note that the chat won't be moderated, as we'll all be actively participating in the event. So just to be aware that if you type anything in there, we won't probably be able to moderate it, and that as it's being recorded, it won't necessarily be private as well. So just to be aware if you're sending messages that it could be part of the recording. Yeah, so we're about to jump in with our expert speakers, and we will have interactive polling throughout. So everyone gets to take an active part in today's session, and we'd really love it if everyone who's interested in today's event lets us know what they think, either during the event or afterwards on social media. We're using the Space Governance and Mars Disaster hashtags on Twitter, and you should be able to see on the bottom right of the screen, sometimes necessary to move the video window, but you can see our other links to our website and social media channels. And yeah, that's about it from me for now. We expect to finish, it's about just after 1 p.m. UK time now, so should be done by 3 p.m. UK time, 2 hours from now, if not before. So yeah, without further ado, I think Lauren has our first interactive polling section.
Hi, yeah, let me just stop sharing for a moment, and I'm going to put up the first poll. So this is the active part where We're going to ask you a question, and we would like to see what you think before we get started into our expertise. So the first question is, why is the Athena mission at Flegramontes? It looks like there's a lot of really diverse interests so far. I'll give it a few more seconds. I see that there's still a few that haven't voted yet. So let's see if we get any. The leader right now is easily accessible buried ice. All right, so keeping these in mind, we'll go ahead and let Tanya begin with her discussion. It looks like, Tanya, they think that we're here for buried ice. That seems to be the winner, but only by a little bit. So it also looks like coming in next would be the mineral deposits for mining, or to slay some giants.
These are some great guesses.
So easily buried, accessible buried ice seems to be the winner. I'm going to now share my screen again so you can go through your discussion on Mars. And I hope that the videos work. Okay. Oh, we also want to mention, sorry, before we get started, happy 8th birthday, Curiosity, and congratulations to the Perseverance mission, of which this is the reason we had our webinar today, to celebrate Curiosity. So here we go. Now we're on Mars.
Great. So the year is 2045, and thanks to a partnership between a consortium of international space agencies, including NASA, CSA, ESA, JAXA, UAE, Australia, New Zealand, all the players you can think of, and the commercial space sector, humanity has established the beginnings of a first permanently staffed station on Mars in this area called Flegramontes. This is an area in the northern mid-latitudes of Mars, and it was chosen as the initial human habitat on Mars because of the accessibility of nearly pure water ice just below the surface. We're talking a few centimeters down to a few meters, depending on where you might be. This area, if we go to the next slide, consists of hummocky mountains. And then in the midst of all these mountains, we have what we call ice-rich debris-covered glaciers, which is exactly what it sounds like. You have a glacier that is covered by ice and rocks and other types of debris. And just underneath that, from what we can tell from things like ground-penetrating radar data from orbit, these features are nearly pure water ice just below that debris covering. And so this makes them really prime candidates for mining this ice for human use, everything from drinking water to manufacturing rocket fuel. If we go to the next slide, these are just some of the views of the glaciers in this area. Now, after we proved out carbon capture technology with an instrument on the Perseverance rover called the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment, or MOXIE, in 2021, larger scale versions of this instrument were designed for implementation for human missions. And these oxygen generators work by drawing in carbon dioxide and separating the oxygen from the carbon. And then we can use the carbon for construction materials, filters, and then we have the oxygen to be breathable. Some of this oxygen ends up being used for propellant production for the transit ships that are eventually going to go to and from Mars, and the rest primarily goes toward the Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS. Now, ECLSS is critical for the survival of the entire base, and because of this, it has computer systems controlling every single component with auxiliary and tertiary redundancies. And this is a system where there is zero room for error. To make sure everybody stays breathing in the space for as long as it is inhabited. This is just a picture of the MOXIE instrument aboard the Perseverance rover. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you to advance the slides there. So the models that we have for these for human size are probably about 10 times this size, if not more. And these show the mechanism. If you click on the video in the lower right, you can actually see just a quick diagram of how this works, where you bring in the carbon dioxide and it's drawing out oxygen, do this really simple cathode anode setup. So it's actually not a very complicated instrument from like a mechanical standpoint. Next slide. The surface of Mars poses additional risks, though, beyond the low atmospheric pressure and temperature, which is part of why we need to have atmospheric generation systems for humans to survive there. It also experiences sporadic strikes by solar energetic particles and cosmic rays because it lacks a protective magnetic field like we have on the Earth. The radiation that we get from these energetic strikes can cause problems for satellites in orbit, as well as assets on the ground if they happen to strike onboard computers. So this is why we want to have multiple redundancies set up in place, because we've had problems with these before, both for rovers. Bit hits like these have sent them into safe mode. They've also sent some of our satellites into safe mode in the past as well. So it's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on in terms of potential disaster scenarios for Mars. And that's all I have for the scene setting for you.
Great. Okay, thank you. Next, I'm going to jump over to Thomas, who's going to set the scene on the governance and mission control side to let us know what's going on from an admin perspective.
Hello. So essentially, we use the International Space Station Agreement as a model for designing a governance structure for a Mars mission. The International Space Station is obviously a very successful example of both international cooperation and permanent human presence in outer space. There's been humans permanently in orbit of the Earth now since the early 2000s, which is quite an accomplishment. Obviously, there would need to be some amendments made for a Mars mission. The missions would have to be of a longer duration. And as we've discussed, there are some more significant risks involved in a Mars mission that would need consideration, because you can't just hop on a Soyuz and come back to Earth if disaster strikes, as you'll find out. So essentially, for the Athena mission agreement, we recognize that it will be some sort of international partnership agreement under the leadership of the United States. This is sort of similar as we're starting to see with the Artemis Accords. And there is a practical reality to this. What NASA and the United States government is able to bring to the table just sort of dwarfs everyone else, and so they understandably want to take a leadership position in any sort of partnership agreement. There will be agreements about how equipment and flight elements are provided, and the rights and responsibilities of the partnership is essentially based on what you contribute. So the more you contribute, the more of a role you have to play. And if you are like, say, Canada and provide a particularly crucial piece of equipment, it turns out you can negotiate a bit more than some of the other partners. So let's bear in mind, develop something really, really vital to the success of a mission operation, like the Canada Arm. The agreement is grounded in international law and the 4 core space treaties. So that's the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention, and that there's a core part about equity and cooperation. There's also agreements about how we share data and the ownership of the data and the equipment in being supplied and funded. So basically, if it's your experiment, you own the data. And even if you do the experiment in a bit of the facility that isn't yours, you still retain the data. And there's a whole set of technical agreements as to how that works. One of the key points for our mission today is that it's a multilateral consensus-based decision-making process among the cooperating agencies. And so that means that somewhere on Earth there will be a group of people who need to get together to discuss major issues. But day-to-day operational decisions do get delegated either to, say, mission control or to the actual crew involved in the mission. And again, there's practical reasons for that. You can't kick it up to some sort of ministerial committee every time you need to decide whether you're going to make a sandwich. Partners are responsible for their own programs. So while there's a lot of cooperation in terms of administrative capacity, you're essentially run as 6 different programs that work together. rather than just one overarching program. That may change from ours, but we're running on the ISS model because that's what we've seen in the past, and we assume that it wants to work together. And again, that makes sense. ESA astronauts want to work on ESA things. NASA astronauts want to work on NASA things. There's quite a bit of pride in representing your country in a space mission, and we would assume that would continue in the future. As far as things like data relays, there tends to be a nominated partner. So for the International Space Station, it's the United States and Russia, but we're assuming that it's going to be the United States and the European Space Agency because Russia's not participating for geopolitical reasons that you should all be aware of. Then costs is an equitable sharing of costs, which again, how much you're participating is how much you have to pay. We have cost waivers for liabilities. Criminal jurisdiction is quite an interesting concept, and there is a specific article in the agreement that deals with criminal jurisdiction, although it's not necessarily all that clear. But basically, countries are responsible for their nationals. So if you are a British astronaut, then the British government takes responsibility for you. But there are situations in which other states involved could have a broader thing. There's also a code of conduct that specifies how crew should behave, what sort of hierarchy there is for making decisions, and it's all sort of rooted in as an international cooperation, but also crew safety. Crew safety is the core, and at the end of the day, getting the crew back alive is more important than the mission. And so if we have to sacrifice scientific objectives in order to keep the crew alive, then that's the way that the code of conduct should go. Obviously, in practice, there's always going to be a balancing element, and it's not necessarily you've failed if you don't bring everyone back alive. It's always a bit more complicated than that. But that's a nice little overview of how the governance structure for our mission works.
Thanks, Thomas. Now you're going to be introduced to our fictional Athena mission crew by Annie. So let me share my screen again, and I'll be ready in just a moment.
Oh, here we go. Well, g'day everybody, and thank you to all of the people on Twitter who helped me put together these crew bios. So I'm really excited to introduce them to you. First up, we've got our flight commander, who is Olivia Martinez. Olivia has expertise in aerospace engineering and robotics and space physics. Her special skills include parachuting, scuba diving, self-defense and hand-to-hand combat, and playing the cello. Olivia is proficient in English, Spanish, and French, and in other notes, it's noted that she mixes excellent cocktails. Our deputy flight commander is Ahmad Almazi. Ahmad has expertise in geological and environmental sciences, rocketry and propulsion, and philosophy. He also is proficient in gymnastics, archery, freediving, mountain climbing, and in an unexplained twist, the banjo. Ahmad can speak Arabic, English, and Russian, and is great at putting IKEA furniture together. Our pilot is Tyson Harris, representing ex-Astra, and Tyson is an aircraft pilot and is skilled in atmospheric science and mechanical engineering. He, in addition to flying fighter aircraft, helicopters, and drones, is very good at long-distance running, mathematics, and lacrosse, no doubt from university days. Tyson speaks English, Spanish, Russian, and German, and was previously a speedrun record holder for Zelda Ocarina of Time, although he notes that this was a long time ago and before many of the glitches had been figured out. Moving on to the next slide, we have the crew surgeon from the Japanese Space Agency, Miyoko Nakamura. She has expertise in medicine and space medicine, which one would hope, as well as chemistry. Her special skills include weightlifting, rock climbing, sword fighting, skiing, and high altitude hiking. She speaks Japanese, English, and Russian, and is an international chess champion. Moving across to our Director of Science, we have Sophie Durand from ESA. Sophie's expertise is in molecular biology and botany, as well as computer science and cyber technology. Her special skills are ski jumping, biathlon, shooting, jazz piano, and abseiling. Sophie speaks French, English, and German, and once represented France in international figure skating when she was a teenager. And our final crew member is Hans Bergman, the Deputy Director of Science. Hans's expertise is in theoretical physics and electrical engineering. Special skills include base jumping, ultralight camping, first aid, Sudoku, and home brewing beer. Hans speaks French, English, German, and Japanese, and had a brief career as a professional opera singer prior to becoming an astronaut. That's all from the crew, and I will hand back to you, Lauren.
Thank you. Those were well thought out. So now we can make it a little more humanized when we go through our Mars disaster. Lastly, we're going to talk to Nadia about what we would have disaster risk reduction and what happens on a post-disaster. So I will share the screen again. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. So to begin with, I think it's really important to understand one core principle, which is when a significant risk exists, failure to plan can be taken as culpable negligence. So as Thomas mentioned earlier, this is a mission that is primarily led by the US sort of objectives, but also in collaboration with ESA. So there is an element of kind of a fused sort of mechanism in order to tackle key parts of this mission. And that same logic can be applied when thinking about emergency management and post-disaster recovery. So as part of that, we need to understand the various different models that are currently being used by the nation states that are involved in this mission. And what I mean by that is investigating the emergency management principles that are optimized by these countries, but then also placing this in a more kind of macro level analysis. So taking principles from the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters, which came into force in 2000, and then also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a global agreement to reduce and prevent disaster risks across the globe. Now, there are obviously other layers to this, which are sort of dependent on the various space agencies who are involved in this process. But ultimately, that the reason why I started off with those kinds of frameworks was to go back to that evidence-based approach, because through those frameworks, we can generate evidence, we can generate scenarios and use that to design an emergency management procedure and also post-disaster recovery procedures on Mars. And that also helps us to understand the risks and hazards for preparedness. So that data sharing that exists between the different agencies and the level of expertise that will be leveraged both on a practitioner level, but then also from a technology level. And again, going back to key messages from previous disasters, that's both disasters on Earth and also space incidents, that will be part of the sort of framework that we would hope would be utilized in this situation. And the culture of civil protection. So the culture of civil protection goes back to the various different models of emergency management used by the different states. So as you will see later on, there are two very different models that I will talk you through, which is the incident command system, and then also the gold, silver, bronze model, which is used in the UK. And then to tie all of this together, we need adequate legislation in order to kind of cement the process of disaster risk recovery, and especially post-disaster recovery. So you need to kind of tie the previous knowledge of previous disasters, understand what you've learned about the hazards and risks from those disasters, which is a bit tricky in the case of Mars because we don't know too much about the human impact that this would have, and then translate those key messages into a somewhat sort of presentable plan, and establish a culture which all of these states who are involved in this mission can agree on, and then help to take that culture and collaboration to a multilateral level to implement legislation, ideally through the UN, to really solidify that process for post-disaster recovery. And that's a synthesis of kind of what I was going to talk about, which of course we've got the major disasters, this major space disasters here for you to kind of ponder on, to think about how this would help with the formulation of our evidence-based approach for the disaster recovery. And then if I could have the next slide. And so the framework that I was kind of alluding to earlier on around taking the messages that we have from previous hazards and risks goes into the disaster cycle. So what do we know before the event? And that goes into the data sharing agreements that you would hope exist between the different states involved in the mission, to help with the mitigation and preparation for this disaster that we will talk about. And that's incredibly important at the moment, because we are seeing that there is competition between states around mitigation and preparation for the disaster that we're currently dealing with at the moment, which is this global pandemic. So if we were to look at the sort of evidence we have right now, apply it to a situation that we would have which involves a disaster on Mars, then there clearly is a need to update current mitigation practices, also data sharing, and analyze some of the cybersecurity risks that come with that. And then moving on to the response, that's when I was talking a little bit about the incident command system and then the gold, silver, bronze system. So essentially, if we're dealing with a model for our emergency plan, we need to understand which model we're going to use and why. So as part of that process, you need to, again, go back to understanding which state is going to be sort of taking the most amount of liability for this, depending on the crew that is involved in the mission, and also the allocation of resources that will be used for this response. And then as part of your recovery phase, the evaluation side of things can also get quite political, depending on the types of agreements that are currently in place around mitigation and preparation, which could impact the reporting of the disaster. And that's quite significant, because a situation on the ground in an instance such as Mars would be very difficult to provide sort of a nuanced picture of the recovery that took place on the ground. Whereas at the moment on Earth, we clearly have a lot more information about the various different types of disasters that occur due to social media, due to different information sources, and also the level of investigation that we can carry out. So the reporting is also quite significant to understand how the recovery actually took place, as opposed to how it was evaluated and reported as taking place. And I think that's very important to consider when designing a plan for an incident on Mars. Have the next slide, please. Yes, and so as part of the recovery process, it's essential that the division of key sites is sort of planned out before. So as part of that, it's important to have impact mapping. And that involves a lot of thorough due diligence about the sorts of chemicals that are present in these areas, you know, how this could lead to cascading disasters, what impact could this have on the relief workers, are there any kind of biological issues that we need to be aware of in terms of allergies, in terms of, you know, issues to do with the types of personnel you have, and where would you place your emergency operations center as part of your impact plan, and also your impact map. That is significant when designing the reconstruction phase, for your disaster recovery. And you see on this graph that we've got here, this is essentially a graph that is designed to kind of give you a sort of an understanding of maybe some of the economic impacts. So it weighs up the sort of level of planning that goes into each phase of the recovery. So your relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction, which, as you can imagine, given the sort of size of this mission and the number of crew involved, that would take up most of your resources as well. And it's only after you've designed your impact map, verified the sites and resources that you would need based on conducting a thorough analysis of previous reconstruction plans used and the economic sort of weighting of each of these elements, so the emergency management, relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and post-disaster development, that you can design a detailed plan. But again, going back to that disaster cycle, this all depends on the level of cooperation and the type of model, the dominant emergency management model, which is adopted by the designers of the mission. Can I have the next slide, please? I think this should be, yeah, that's it. I also want to talk a little bit more in detail about the kind of critical incident stress debriefing, which would need to occur as part of the sort of emergency response and recovery. But I believe we can have a bit more conversation about that later on, if that's easier, if we're not over time.
Yeah, thanks, because we'll get a chance for all of you to, again, kind of go through things in a more rapid fire way as we go through our polling. So I believe now we have a error and there is now a disaster. So Tanya's going to walk us through the disaster and there will be a new polling question. But I will let her explain the disaster first.
Can we put the slides up?
Yes.
This is an alert from the Mars Disaster Response System. We've had a fateful day at the fledgling base where a cosmic ray hit has triggered a cascading failure within the oxygen generation system, causing a decrease in oxygen levels throughout the habitat. This is resulting in cognitive impairment of the crew as their blood oxygen levels drop. So how can the crew repair the damage while being isolated from real-time communication with Earth and they're being unable to function at full physical and mental capacity?
Let me get up our next polling question. Oh no, disaster has struck. What do we do first? Please vote now. Just a couple more seconds. It looks like we don't care much about mission control today. Okay. I will now end the polling. It looks like check the disaster management plan and mission plan. So I will ask that Thomas and then Nadia give a quick rapid fire answer as to what that might look like, and then we'll go to the others for some more information. So Thomas?
Yeah, I mean that's the answer that I would vote for. Particularly in a margin situation, you need to be aware of the fact that you've got a time delay, and could be twiddling your thumbs for quite a while you're waiting for mission control to get back to you. And their response might be, "We need to figure this out and get back to you." So checking the mission plan and any disaster management plans is probably is a good first step to take, because while the pre-mission planners will not have thought of all of the potential disasters, you'll sort of be able to glean the technical circumstances of like, well, what works, and if something's broken, what might be the problem, or what would the first step to take be to sort of get things under control? Is there a button that we can press that like at least stops the bleeding? And then you can get in contact with mission control and say, oh, something's gone wrong, help please.
Okay, Nadia, how would we address looking at if there's any kind of mission plan they've already got that would involve potential disasters?
Yes, so you should evaluate the mission plan that you have in relation to the disaster that has occurred, bearing in mind that emergency management plans are subject to change. And if we go back to the impact maps that you would need to create. So you would ultimately refer to the accuracy of those impact maps and to see whether or not your plan is still viable based on the impacts that have been outlined and based on the disaster that's currently occurred. And your emergency management plan will kind of give you more information about the sort of emergency commander who will either lead the entire operation, depending on which model you've opted for. So you should have an emergency management plan that either goes for example, in this instance, the incident command system, which is a US system for emergency management, or maybe a UK system such as the gold, silver, and bronze, or another sort of system that has been nominated to best suit the conditions of the area that you're responding to. So that also weaves into the sort of international agreement that you would have in place to solidify your plans for the emergency management process.
All right, Annie, how's our crew doing? What do you think they're thinking? How are they handling it?
Well, this is a great question, and I think it's good to think about what we should do. But what we know from analogues and from our long history of doing science in Antarctica at bases there is that teams under great stress in extreme environments often form very close bonds. So it's possible that they will identify more strongly as being part of that team than being from any nation or any agency or even from Earth itself. And this is particularly true in a disaster. So it's possible that in the case of a disaster, a team might be tempted to go it alone. And someone called Joe in the chat actually alluded to this in that, you know, could we talk about a Martian state? Now, I think putting that aside for a moment, it's important that they make contact with mission control and that Olivia Martinez as commander establishes that authority and ensures that everyone has a job and knows their job. But I think the key thing is that there's a 20-minute delay, say, then if they keep doing things and sending more information as they look into it, there will be a 20-minute delay from the last piece of information to possibly the first bit of useful feedback from mission control. So it might be tempting to spam with information, and that can be a great strategy. But I would say the key thing when something like this happens is reconnaissance. So really, if you want my point of view on this, if the flight commander, the mission commander wants to ask mission control for guidance, that's great. But in the meantime, she'll need to make sure that everyone's kept very busy doing all sorts of activities, checking things, reading things, understanding the problem in great detail, rather than jumping straight into trying to fix it. Because ultimately mission control can't help them if they've done something and mission control doesn't know that they've done that until 20 minutes after they've reported that, by which time mission control then has to work up a whole new plan, which then takes another 20 minutes to get back. So basically, I think that they need to draw on their skills of following protocol that they might have learned through things like scuba diving, rather than the aggression of hand-to-hand combat.
All right, and then Tanya, what does this mean for Flagramontes and Mars, including the habitat as well as outside of the habitat, as we're now in an issue that could be also detrimental to the planet itself?
The only issues I can see would be if you run into some kind of planetary protection issue, if there's a problem with the oxygen generation unit where you have some kind of seals that are broken. But in general, Mars will probably be okay from something like this.
All right, so now we're going to get our next poll up. The commander has, unfortunately, at the same time, found to have appendicitis. What are we going to do? Commander has appendicitis and urgently needs medical attention. However, conducting surgery might result in the death of the entire crew because of oxygen shortage usages and all hands on deck supporting the surgery versus solving the problem. What should they do? Again, it looks like we are not waiting for mission control today. I'll give you just a couple more seconds. Looks like we've got an astounding answer here. All right, I'll go ahead and end the polling now. So the winner is give the medication and wait it out while they solve the disaster issue. I'm going to start with Annie because I know she has some points on this from a medical perspective.
Thank you. Yes, so in preparation for this, I reached out to some people with medical expertise, particularly medicine in extreme locations and disaster medicine. And particularly, I reached out to someone called V. Tran from Adelaide, who is a medical student doing research into space medicine. And she then spoke to Dr. Rowena Christensen, who I see is with us today in the chat there and as a participant. So hello, and thank you for coming along. Dr. Rowena Christensen is the founder of the Ad Astra Vita project and website and is here today as a participant. So thank you for coming along. Okay, here's the lowdown. Appendectomies and appendicitis is quite serious. In extreme environments, the immune system is affected negatively, so the appendix may actually be necessary. In terms of doing surgery, the appendix is difficult to find. There's also the gravity question to consider. Mars has a different gravity to Earth, so that will make surgery easier or more difficult, who knows. In terms of equipment, we're looking at something similar to Antarctica if we were to do an operation on this, and we have to think about post-operative care as well. And we had a note here that diagnosing it will actually be quite difficult without proper ultrasound equipment. That said, I can talk to Antarctic appendectomies because I've actually met an ex-Soviet scientist who has assisted on 3 appendectomies in his time in Antarctica, including the first one on an Antarctic traverse. And according to him, the low temperature made it very difficult because of the blood coagulation issues, and much vodka was involved for all. He said that you need 3 people to do an appendectomy in Antarctica. One is the patient, one is the doctor, and one of them holds the stomach apart. So that was his job. Now, the Australian Antarctic Division requires the procedure of appendectomy before people go to Antarctica. No other nation requires this, but I think this is quite fascinating and maybe something that Australia can offer the world when it comes to Mars. But really what this comes down to is, for my money, an ethical question. It's a trolley problem, if you will. It's, do we take the utilitarian view, or do we take the no, there is right and wrong and we shall not kill view? And in this situation, the difference between taking action versus just withholding care is a really fraught one, particularly as in this group, it would have to be a group decision. And if the deputy, or who would no doubt step up in this case, makes the call, the rest of the team may not accept it, and particularly the surgeon. The flight surgeon really has a lot of authority in this case, and if she feels that surgery must be done, then she's going to push for that. But if everyone refuses to assist, she's going to be in a lot of trouble. So really, I think this is at its heart an ethical question, and a group ethical question that the entire group has to make itself. I do think that it makes sense to me that the polling question there, that, you know, you would medicate and you would wait and see, because sometimes you might be able to delay it. It may be able to sort of be mild and resolve itself. But ultimately, you know, this does really come down to that ethical trolley problem, but magnified 1,000-fold, because if you've got 3 people trying to do surgery on someone on Mars, which is hard enough, you're going to have a lot fewer people working on the rest of the project.
Great. I would like to get Thomas to give us some legal quasi-advice, as well as discussion on maybe what this means in terms of the rescue agreement of astronauts.
Yeah, so I think the key word for today, and generally speaking in governance, is balance. And Annie highlighted a lot of the key sort of considerations that you would take into account. You know, you obviously have an obligation to the sick or injured person, but you also have an obligation to the entire crew. And you do see these sorts of questions arise in extreme environments, or maritime disasters used to be another key one as well. Of, you know, you sometimes have to prioritize saving the ship or saving the facility over saving an individual member of the crew, because if you don't save the facility, everyone's going to die. And you know, you have to take into consideration of, like, what is the disaster. If it's going to take, you know, 3 days for you to run out of air, then you might have time to deal with the appendicitis. If the illness is something that could wait till you fix the problem, then you can afford to wait to do the medical procedure. And whilst it's good to have sort of a code of conduct or guidance in place to begin with, you also need to be aware of the fact that people don't necessarily do what they're supposed to do, especially in an emotional situation. Like, you've been working with this person for probably several years. You're going to care about this person. You're not just going to go, oh, we're going to let them die because we need to fix the Moxie device. You know, humans don't work in that sort of cold, calculating way. As far as things like the rescue agreement go, and you know, there are some limitations. I mean, for starters, the rescue agreement, as it is currently written, predominantly focuses on astronauts who've returned to Earth. But you know, states have the obligation under the rescue agreement to render assistance where it's possible. Now, what that assistance might mean could vary. So, if say the Russians are the experts on conducting removing appendixes in extreme environments, then maybe we need to get a Russian surgeon on the telemedicine hotline to advise on how to actually do it. But these are sort of things, like, they haven't been tested. Right? I can point to sections of the treaties that say you should provide assistance, but whether international states agree. So this is something that should be considered before we start to plan, say, a Mars mission. Of, like, well, maybe we need a soft law document to outline, well, what does render assistance actually mean in practice? You know, oftentimes it's envisioned that, say, the Russian government would be obliged to render assistance if they actually had another Mars base and they could render shelter. But perhaps there's a broader meaning of assistance here. But again, as I say, the key word for today is always balance. And there's, you know, it's hard to determine what is the right or wrong answer. And the facts on the ground will always determine that, and there's always wiggle room there. You know, any sort of these, if it came down to an inquiry or a trial at the end of the mission, you know, there would be some acceptance that you made the best choice that you thought was the best choice at the time, even if, like, well, with hindsight we can say, oh look, there's a whole bunch of different things we could have done. Well, that's easy to say 10 years later, but at the time, as long as you're making the best decision that you think is the best decision based on reasonable grounds, then that's the way you should go.
Okay, Nadia, do you have anything to add from a disaster planning perspective?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that when it comes to these casualties, there is the option to use the triage method. So basically determining the nature of the injuries and the victims of the disaster, varies considerably. But what the triage system does is it helps to classify the injuries in terms of what benefits a patient can be expected to receive from immediate or short-term treatment. Not the severity of the injury itself. It is a form of kind of rationing of healthcare, which is important in the situation that we're dealing with here. It's really to kind of help manage the allocation of resources, as we spoke about kind of earlier on. So as part of this, the factoring in of using a triage system to tackle these kinds of medical emergencies would be a key component in your kind of emergency plan. And the triage is usually carried out in 2 stages. Of course, this is subject to change and subject to adaptation, depending on the environment we're in. But it's at the scene of the disaster to determine who receives that priority. So again, it would go back to the sort of importance of that person to that mission in terms of their skills, their abilities. And that does sound very kind of contradict some of the points that have been made earlier, but just purely from a sort of management perspective, that's one of the points that is considered. And the process involves, noting certain details about the patient, which you would already have based on their sort of medical records. And then also a simple investigation of some of the sort of cardiovascular, respiratory and neurological functions of that person. Obviously, I am not a doctor, I'm not an expert, so I can't make the call on exactly what would happen, but I know that in terms of managing the process, you would need a triage system in order to kind of streamline that process of medical emergencies.
All right. And Tanya, do you want to weigh in as we're thinking about our bigger disaster and now this surgery at the same time, or potential surgery?
I mean, this definitely introduces complications because now not only are you distracted and unable to be cognitively on top of things because of your oxygen generation issue, you're dealing with the added stress of this situation. And so, I mean, I'm not that kind of doctor, but I assume that this definitely creates for not the best space for making the necessarily correct or rational decisions when you're going through this process.
All right, we're now on to our next polling question. This is not a good day for the Athena mission. They now have a hardware issue and they're not really sure what to do. So it looks like we've got to now deal back with our bigger issue of fixing the problem for the oxygen levels to be back. We have this hardware issue. What do we do? Let's see what we say. I'll give it a couple of seconds. All right, in this case, it looks like we're actually thinking about bringing in mission control a bit more. So, all right, I'll end the polling now. It looks like the winner is wait for mission control. They will know what to do. All right, so I will start now with Tanya. What do you think we would be doing in this scenario, and potentially what kind of hardware issue would that be?
So as we saw in the diagram earlier, the MOXIE instrument itself is not particularly complicated, so it shouldn't be tricky to try and track down what part might be failing. There's probably something going on with the reaction that you have between your cathode and your anode setup to actually cause that conversion to happen. So if that's not functioning, you're not actually stripping off the carbon from the CO2 to get your oxygen. So you should be able to go through, have sort of like a through there, check the parts one by one. But again, you're in this state where you're mentally incapacitated and stressed out by the medical effects on both yourself and the appendicitis that you're dealing with the commander. So that might make it a little harder to actually go through that logically, make sure that you're doing the correct engineering analysis. And so I could see this being a case where contacting mission control might be helpful because you have this external third party that's not being so affected by this both physically and emotionally, and they can try to sort of more coldly walk you through what is going on, like telling you, keeping you on track, check this, check this, check this, but you are still dealing with that communications delay. So the question arises, do you have time to be able, for each thing on that checklist, wait 20 minutes for your signal to get to Earth, wait 20 minutes for that signal to come back to Mars? You know, maybe this disaster happens when you're lucky and you're closest to Earth, and then the communication delay is only, you know, maybe 5 to 8 minutes, but that's still a lot of time when you're going through a checklist of multiple components inside a system. So it's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it, but I could see this being the first case where contacting mission control might actually be the rational decision.
All right, Thomas, let's get your perspective from what we should be doing on a governance and how mission control can sort of support that.
Yeah, the commander of the mission actually has quite a lot of authority. In terms of the ISS agreement and our Athena mission agreement, it essentially says that the commander is responsible for day-to-day operations under the direction of the flight director. Now, on the International Space Station, there really isn't a communications delay, so they can actually have a conversation. And I think, as Tanya highlighted, how you refer to mission control will really depend on the communications delay, but also probably the urgency of the mission, of the issue. So I would envision the flight director sending perhaps standing orders for the day or maybe even the week, rather than having a sort of a minute-by-minute instruction situation. So I think the realities of being on Mars or even or any other missions further beyond, essentially you do have to be quite reliant upon the crew that you actually have with you. You might want to check up with mission control to make sure that you're not doing anything particularly stupid, or that there aren't any longer impacting decisions that you're making that they would want to override. But again, if you've got to wait 20 minutes for them to get back to you, you can't necessarily sit around and wait for that to happen.
And I want to add on that for you, Thomas, for you to view. You said commander, but at this stage, since the commander may be under heavy medication, would we then assume this is the deputy commander, and when there had been a formal changing of duties before this happened?
Yeah, that's good catch, Lauren. I've forgotten about that. So yeah, so the code of conduct specifies a chain of command, and so if the commander is incapacitated or dies, then it would go to the deputy commander, and it should be more or less automatic. I mean, under normal circumstances, you may want some sort of ceremony. Again, on the International Space Station, they do have a little ceremony that hands over control from one commander to another. But you're in the middle of the disaster, you don't necessarily bother with those sort of formalities. Now, there may be questions as to when does command transfer? I mean, if she's just on painkillers, then is she sufficiently out of it for command to transfer? And that might cause some problems. And so you might want to refer to mission control for them to go, yeah, no, if you're taking, you're giving her morphine, she's no longer in command. On the other hand, you may have freestanding orders in the code of conduct that say, if you have to take this level of painkiller, your authority is at least temporarily transferred to the next person on the chain of command.
Okay, Annie, we're going to check in and see how all of our crew are doing, and if you've got any information on how they'd be handling the hardware issue and that their commander is out for the count for the moment.
Absolutely. So I think the key thing here is that the crew are going to be dealing with potentially low oxygen levels, which means that while action will be required, their work and their decision making is likely to be impacted. As an analog for this kind of effect, we could consider what sleep deprivation does. I don't know if anyone's experienced long periods of sleep deprivation, but when I used to work as an investment banker, I can tell you that there was no amount of checking that would make something right when it's like 3 a.m. in the morning after 2 weeks of that. So at this point, I think it's very clear that they will need to really rely on mission control and be patient and wait. So in many ways, the response of listening to music and having something to eat may actually be the best one, in that doing nothing and waiting for mission control to come back and being patient with that is a good idea. The other side of this is morale will probably be pretty low at this point. So the deputy flight commander, who'll now be in control, may wish to throw an impromptu banjo concert. I think the other thing we could note is that it's possible that Miyoko Nakamura, our surgeon, will be doing better than most because of her high altitude hiking background. So maybe in this case, the deputy commander may actually appoint her to take on some more decision-making capability, or to take over in the event of when she judges as doctor, he is incapacitated. So this is something we can consider as well, is that as a team, they really need to be looking at where their attributes are and aligning them in that way. I just had one other thing to add on the kind of philosophy side of things around the answer that was, let's just listen to music and eat. It's quite strange the way that when you are looking at life and death, you kind of find these weird sort of resignations. I had a couple of years ago a bad post-tonsillectomy hemorrhage, and found myself thinking, I might die. And it's a really interesting thing. And I found I was really quite calm. And last year, when I was helping my aunt on her farm, I came across, with no mobile reception, a calf that was sort of lying in the sun dying. And there was just me and this cow, and there was nothing. There was no mobile reception. I tried. There was nothing to be done. I'm not a vet. So I sort of looked at it and was like, well, you know, the crows are circling, I guess you're going to die. So I put on music and we listened to some of my favorite metal, because I was like, if anything's going to inspire this cow to live, it's metal. And then after 15 minutes, the cow was still alive. So I was like, cool, we're going to live. So, you know, I managed to like pop my jumper in the creek and get some water, and the cow was fine. And after about 5 hours, we were good and the cow lived, and it was awesome. But my point is that the idea of facing death, and especially in a climate like Mars, where you're so far away from everything, I think, you know, sometimes these philosophical responses are what a crew would go to, and they're not necessarily a bad thing, because they can really help everyone regroup and be calm in the face of disaster. But yes, that was a little tangent from me. I'll hand back.
So the last, Nadia, I do have a question. If you think boosts to morale or any kind of team building are factored into any kind of disaster management plan, if there's something along these lines of kind of keeping the team together and keeping them motivated, or if that's not a factor in a typical disaster management plan.
No, it absolutely is a factor, and it should be a factor if it's not. And you need to have the right professionals as part of your team. So even if you have emergency responders, they need to have some kind of qualification in being able to deal with people who have these post-traumatic stress disorder and stress induced through these disasters. And that's essential to the post-disaster recovery process. So as Annie kind of pointed out earlier, you know, small things like having something to eat, going to a safe space, being around people that you feel comfortable being with is very important to the disaster recovery plan. And this is why your emergency operations center should include a quiet room or a space, even if it's not in the center, maybe in close proximity to it in this instance, where you can facilitate that kind of dialogue and where you can cater towards all of these human needs. So it's not just about kind of having the right personnel on the ground. It's about having that individuals, you know, ensuring that individuals are trained to deal with human beings. And it's even more important when you're in these extreme environments. And maybe later on I can talk you through the sort of debriefing models that you can use or have been used so far in post-disaster recovery processes, which are very much centered around human needs, and also dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes with any disaster. So it is absolutely crucial for the plans.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I think we are now at the point where Annie has got some news, as we are now coming into, they're starting to solve their problems on Mars, but now we have to see what happens to finalize kind of getting things back to a stable condition, and what will happen post-disaster. Are they going home? Do they get to finish their mission? Is anyone coming? So Annie, I'll let you give us the kind of, I guess, news that would go public to us back on Earth, anxiously awaiting the results.
Thanks, Lauren. Yes, as we sat here, a pigeon knocked on the window and an urgent letter was delivered from NASA HQ. As to why they chose someone in Sydney to read it, I don't know, but I think they just wanted to hear it in the Aussie accent. It's an urgent communique from the NASA administrator. I'll read it. Reads as follows. Good morning. This message is coming to you from Tanya Mackenzie in the capacity of my role as NASA administrator. I've just come from a briefing with Mission Control. As you will be aware, late yesterday we received word from the Athena Mars mission that there was an unexpected and potentially fatal failure of crucial mission hardware. We have been working through the night with the brave astronauts on Mars to resolve the problem. I am pleased to report that an hour ago we received an all clear message from the mission and that the problem has now been rectified. I extend my deepest thanks to the crew at Mission Control and to the crew on Mars. This is truly a moment to be thankful. But our celebration must be tempered with the knowledge of what this victory has cost. It is with deep sadness that I announce that Flight Commander Olivia Martinez has embarked on her final mission. In the early hours of this morning, following medical complications, Flight Commander Martinez passed away. Flight Commander Martinez is a hero and a true leader who sacrificed her life for the survival of those under her command. I had the pleasure of interviewing Martinez for the role, and when I asked her what she thought was the most important element of being a leader, she said, "It's quite simple. Succeed or fail, the captain goes down with the ship." Flight Commander Olivia Martinez, leader of the Athena mission, we salute you and your sacrifice. You will be remembered for generations to come as one of the great heroes of our voyages into the stars and those voyages yet to come. Well, that concludes the announcement from NASA. I'll hand back to Lauren to lead us into the next phase.
Thank you. Keeping that in mind, that now we have a bittersweet ending and we've got 5 of our 6 crew safe and still on Mars. Our last question is, what do you think happens post-disaster? I'll give it a few more seconds. All right, it looks like we will have mission continues until possible to return to Earth. The post-mission inquiry will be held. So first I'd like to start with Tanya to describe when we might have that crew being able to return and what that would look like, because they might have to stay a bit longer, and what that means for them post-mission in the habitat.
So Mars and Earth are only well aligned for the transit to come back once every 2 years. You have to kind of have the planets at this nice close approach to be able to get the good arc between one and the other. So depending on where you are in the mission timeline, they might not be able to come back immediately. This could also be impacted by the oxygen generation failures with the MOXIE instrument if you perhaps have a problem with your supply in terms of the oxygen to create your rocket fuel. So you might get some time there where you have to take this into account. This could also impact the send your future mission to go to the space, because you can't have folks like coming on the way to try to help them, for example, until you're in one of those 2-year launch windows as well. You could theoretically launch outside of those, but your transit time would be significantly longer. It would take more fuel, so we don't tend to launch outside of those areas at all.
Okay. Before we go into the next point, because I think Nadia and Thomas are going to have a lot to discuss post-mission, Annie, I'd like to see how the morale is with the crew and what they're feeling and what they're going to be doing to try to maintain what they can before they're able to leave.
Absolutely. Well, I think the group really needs to coalesce, and I think that mourning and marking the death in some way will be very important from a social cohesion point of view. I think as an example of something similar, but absolutely not the same, would be the story of the scientists I studied at Vostok Station. And at the fall of the Soviet Union, word was sent to the Soviet commander, and this was a cooperative mission, by the way. It was a scientific program with Soviets, French, and Americans. Information was sent that the Soviet Union was over, and the designs for a new flag were sent. The Soviet Union sewed this new flag from scraps of fabric in secret, and then on Boxing Day, everyone stood outside and they lowered the Soviet flag and raised the new one. And it was reported from the French guy who was there that everybody cried, including the Americans, who in theory were locked in a geopolitical struggle and a Cold War. So I use that as an example only because I think that in situations of loss and of emotional turmoil, the entire group, they're so close, they will all feel it. And I think that it's really make or break. They can either come together, coalesce, be together in that, or I think it will really spell the end of the mission, and it'll be a very dysfunctional mission because they do have to stay there for a bit longer until they're able to come back to Earth. So that will be the important thing. In terms of future missions and what happens then, I think, all I'd say there is that future missions can only occur if there's sufficient appetite from the general public. And in this case, it's tricky. I mean, a trip to Mars is probably a one-way ticket, and people will know that. But at the same time, if it's handled badly, and if after this the mission falls apart and all of the remaining crew members start infighting and there are problems, dare I say even a Martian murder, then we will see really big issues, and it may be that we don't have appetite to do this sort of thing again, which would be a shame. So so I do think it's really important that mission control supports the crew to be unified at this time. Okay,
Now I will ask Nadia to give the post-disaster breakdown, the critical incident report from a disaster side, and then we will finalize with Thomas giving what mission control would do and what this inquiry would look like back on Earth. So Nadia?
The immediate sort of recovery and response phase of the disaster. So in this context, the response refers to the emergency actions taken both during the impact of a disaster and the short-term aftermath. So immediate kind of after, and the principal emphasis is on saving and safeguarding human lives. And then the second part is the recovery. So the process of repairing the damage, that's both, as much as we can, psychological, and also in terms of any other sort of medical issues that might occur, restoring services. So you may have issues around the emergency operations control, the technical issues that we spoke about, and reconstructing facilities after the disaster has struck. And I think that's critical, because we were talking earlier on about the sort of stabilizing as much as we can the crew's sort of mental health and well-being, and that's why you need to make sure that these facilities are as safe as possible. So I want to talk a little bit about the critical incident stress debriefing model, which is often used in post-disaster recovery process. And the purpose of this is to assess the psychological impact of the incident in order to mitigate the impact of work-related stress amongst these emergency planners and also emergency responders, which you can apply to this situation. And this links widely into the sort of, once they come back to Earth, or if once they're on their way back to Earth, how you would deal with the stress. So it's very crucial that this model is followed through, or there's another alternative model in place which is adapted to the environment on Mars, which you would hope would exist. So as part of this, you should have an introduction phase which assesses the impact of the critical incident on the support personnel and survivors. And you will have a designated facilitator. Usually this individual has a background in psychology, so they're able to, they're qualified to be able to facilitate these sessions. And they usually lead on the assessments on the participants. And then the participants, in this case the crew, introduce themselves and share their initial statements, making note of any key information. It's down to the facilitator to make sure that they have as much information as possible about these individuals in that introduction phase. And the introduction phase, as part of the sort of all of this process, occurs in the Emergency Operations Center, or the safe space that has been designated for the crew and survivors. And then after that, you need to identify the facts. So what are the key issues involving safety and security? That's both safety and security now, and issues that will arise in the future. So this sort of method is conducted through prompts and questioning, and it's down to the group's facilitator to gain a better understanding on the individual perceived sense of safety and security. And I think that's crucial, because that perceived sense of safety and security is bound to shift as we're going, leaving the sort of scene of disaster and thinking about returning back to Earth. So again, I would emphasize that in this scenario, you would probably need to repeat the processes that I'm going to outline several times. So you should have a few critical incident debriefing sessions. And then you need to go into the sort of the thought part of the critical debriefing session. So really allowing for that diffusion and ventilation of thoughts, emotions, and experiences associated with the event to provide a validation of the reaction. So again, going back to Annie's point that she made earlier on, it is, this is that point about speaking with friends and speaking with people that you're comfortable venting to. So that can only be done if you have the safe space. So the safe space needs to be maintained throughout this entire process, and that the facilitator needs to provide the safe space. So you'll see a theme emerging here. It's really on the facilitator to have the right training, both in terms of the medical training and that emergency responder resilience training, in order to make sure that this process can be carried out effectively. And so during this stage, the facilitator validates each person's unique experience and reactions, assuring participants that their responses to the traumatic events are valid and normal. And so I think it's important at this point to emphasize that whoever this facilitator is needs to be able to deal with the sort of cross-section of cultures and different groups that you're working with and individuals that we have on this mission. So you may want to think about providing maybe more than one facilitator and ensuring that they have adequate training for this. And then the reaction, predicting future events and reactions in the aftermath of the incident. So participants are further supported by being made aware of possible reactions that may resurface as the days, weeks, and months progress. Usually this is linked to that post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is why it's essential to monitor all of this information and keep a record of it so you can help these individuals as part of their recovery once they're experiencing that post-traumatic stress disorder. And this knowledge empowers trauma survivors to plan for the future. And it also, kind of creates that collective sort of emotional safe space that you need to have. And then number 5 is symptoms. So conducting a systematic review of the critical incident again, and its emotional, cognitive, and physical impacts on the survivors. So you would have already done this before, as you would know who's been injured the most. You've probably gone through the triage method to understand who to treat and how and where and why. But you need to keep doing this, especially as part of this critical incident response sort of model. And you need to look for any behaviors that might have kind of occurred in direct response to the disaster that weren't there before. And this is how you're going to understand the level of trauma that this individual is experiencing. And when observing those participants' moods, word choices, perceptions, thoughts, it's the facilitator that remains alert to any of these behaviors that might inhibit a survivor's ability to recover or cope with physical or psychological reactions. Common behaviors can include substance abuse, avoidance, withdrawal, anxiety, turning to anger. So this is why I suggest it would be ideal to have more than one facilitator, because of the sort of severity and the unprecedented nature of this incident. And then teaching, bringing closure to the incident, absolutely essential as part of that post-disaster recovery process. So you need to anchor or ground the individual to community resources. So they need to be in place. You may want to have a range of resources for different segments of the mission, and to initiate that rebuilding process. And that rebuilding process, you can continue it until they're back to earth and safe for months, if not maybe years after this has happened. And as stated previously, this model is intended to be the survivor's main source of treatment. Therefore, it's important that the group participants are educated on other resources available to them. And then the final part of this model is about re-entry. So the debriefing assists in the re-entry process to the sort of community or into the sort of mission objectives, which you would need to continue to carry out, and that includes the returning safely back to Earth. Survivors, may be better equipped to regain a sense of safety, security, well-being, allowing them to return back to normal. So if this process is done well, and again, if it's repeated as you move into different phases of the mission and sort of returning back to Earth, then you should have a decent sort of recovery plan in place, and this will be sort of the foundation of the rest of the recovery after this disaster. But as I said before, this model has been used for disasters on Earth, but I strongly believe that it does need to be adapted to suit the environment that we are dealing with and the different sort of stages of recovery that will come afterwards. But it's the foundation.
Thank you. Okay, and last, Thomas will give us from more of a legal background what would happen in this inquiry phase and what that means for the governance of this mission and future missions.
I said earlier, the keyword for today is balance. And so I think, of this poll, I don't know that there was a right answer. There's perhaps one wrong answer for the reason that Tanya highlighted, that depending on where the planets are aligned, you can't just turn around and come home. But you'll need to assess, what resources do you have left? What's the condition of the mission? How possible is it to continue as normal? One of the things you need to consider is that going to Mars is going to be a very expensive process. So we've spent a lot of money and time and expertise in sending these people to Mars. Just because something's gone wrong doesn't mean we necessarily want to bring them back as soon as possible, particularly if it is possible to continue the mission. And so there will need to be a balance to determine that. This is, of course, complicated by the fact that this is an international cooperative mission in which all parties have a stake. So you might have one country that says, no, you got to bring them home as soon as it is possible to do so, whereas the other mission partners might be saying, no, let them stay. We've spent however many millions of dollars going there, so let's get it finished. Regardless of outcome, there will always certainly have to be some sort of inquiry, and that's not necessarily to assert any kind of blame. Inquiries at the most basic level are about what can we learn from this mission or from this incident. And again, even if everybody did everything that they were supposed to do, even if everybody made the right decision that everyone would agree with, there's always going to be something that you can learn from a disaster or an incident. It is the sad reality that virtually all of our safety regulations are written in blood. We always learn something from a disaster, and particularly in an incident when someone has died, we owe it to the victims to make sure that we learn something from this incident, and that the next mission is better planned, better prepared to deal with the things that might come across. And sort of finally, as someone has died, we have the question of, well, what do you do with their body? And there are multiple levels to this question. On a planetary protection level, the human body is filled with lots of sort of things that we don't necessarily want to be releasing into the Martian environment. This is a challenge anytime we talk about sending human missions. There is kind of a resignation, recognition that there's going to be a limit to the amount of containment that you can have once you introduce humans to Mars. But it still doesn't mean that we want to bury a human body in the Martian environment. But beyond the sort of like practical or scientific questions, there are cultural things. And it's interesting to see how attitudes have shifted towards these things. You can see it with, say, soldiers' remains. In the First World War, we buried all of our soldiers basically where they died. But nowadays, Western countries some of whom go to extraordinary lengths to bring our soldiers' remains home. And so there may be differing opinions on this. The astronauts may want to be buried on Mars. That may be something they feel very strongly about. But you may have the families or the communities are like, no, we want her body brought back so that we can give her a hero's burial. And while it isn't something that people will be enthusiastic about having to think about, even the possibility of dying on one of these missions is quite high. And therefore, it is a possibility that needs to be factored into whatever governance framework you build of, well, yeah, what do we do with the body?
All right, well, at this point, we have gotten through all of our scenario points and all of our questions. So I'd like to thank the participants as well as the attendees for coming today, and hopefully we all learned something and started thinking about the finer details of a Mars mission and what happens when there's a disaster, both pre-disaster, during, and post. I'll now have William end the session for us with some information that he's got about what happens after this event in terms of the center. So I will share my screen once again, and William, then the floor will be yours. Okay. Can you see it?
Great, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our participants today. I really enjoyed it and hope you did too. And thank you to the audience. Hope you enjoyed taking part, an active part in today. We'd also like to give a special thank you to the people who donated through the Eventbrite page. and to our patrons on Patreon, because it does impact our ability to put this on in the future. So really is very much appreciated and does have a real impact. If you did enjoy today's webinar, please do consider making a donation through Patreon and checking out our page there, because even a really small amount does, as I say, make a collective contribution. So it's really pretty beneficial, and you get some nice exclusive access to some of our content as well. So it might be of interest to a lot of you. In any case, thank you to everyone again for participating, to all of our experts. I really enjoyed it, and to all of our audience members. Yes, so as mentioned, we will follow up via email, and this will be available to view on our website and YouTube channel. So yeah, just once again, if you do know anyone who you think would be interested, do send them our way. And yeah, thanks again. So wishing everyone an excellent rest of the week. And yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a reminder, we put out a blog post today on the Curiosity rover, so feel free to check out our musings on the birthday of the Curiosity rover on Mars.
I just want to thank everybody for participating and joining us. It's been a fantastic event. As I say, we're coming up on our 3rd anniversary of the founding of the center, and I think this is a great to see where we've started to where we've come from to this event today. It's just been a fantastic thing to see. I saw a few mentions in the chat earlier about Martian independence. We do actually have a paper on that subject. So if you check out our website under the research papers tab, I produced a paper a little while ago about how you actually go about creating an independent state in outer space. So check that out, and hopefully answer all your questions. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.